Hello, humans. Alright, so in the last video I made about religious pluralism being self-refuting, all religions cannot be true, I stated at the end of my video that curious questions deserve credible and acceptable answers, and I invited people to ask me questions. Well, I got one. Now this person wrote to me and said, "Is asking if the Great Flood was real a curious question? I mean, I'm not curious on whether or not it actually happened. It has been proven that a massive flood that covered the whole earth never happened. What I'm curious about is how you believe in it, because if you truly believe the depiction in the Bible is correct as it's written, then you are simply delusional. If consider the actual evidence more than the Bible, but you still want the Bible to be true, do you say it was a local flood? If that's the case, then you'd have to say that God is a liar, since he promised to never do that again, and floods are just a normal occurrence in some places. Or is it just a completely different justification?" Okay, so this person seems to be a critic. In fact, I think I've seen this person comment on my videos a few times before. So, my response in this video is not for the critics who actively seek arguments, but for anyone who is watching who is truly seeking after the Lord with a desire to understand. So, is there evidence of a universal flood? Now, before we discuss the arguments for a worldwide flood, let's address arguments made against a worldwide flood. So when people say that there's no evidence of a worldwide flood, they typically argue things such as the silt deposits that a universal flood would have left are found only in the Mesopotamian valley, not over the entire world, and there's not enough water in the world to cover the highest mountains like Genesis 7:20 claims. In addition, that much water would have caused problems with the rotation of the earth, etc. Many other arguments like that. However, many of these same people typically claim that all the evidence points to a universe that's billions of years old. So let's connect some dots here. First and foremost, the arguments in favor of an old-aged universe, they all possess presuppositions that cannot be proven. For example, in radioactive dating, there are lead isotopes which can be measured at a known rate and then calculated to form the conclusion that many rocks in the Earth's crust are billions of years old. Though plausible, this simply cannot be proven. For one must assume at least two things in order to come to the conclusion that the world is billions of years old. So first, it must be assumed that there were no lead deposits at the beginning. Second, one must assume that the rate of decay has been unchanged throughout its entire history. But neither can be proven. Hence, there is no way to prove by radioactive dating that the world is billions of years old. Likewise, dating the Earth based on salt and minerals is also plausible, yet unable to be proven. Though the calculations may seem absolute, one must first assume that there were no salts and minerals in the ocean at the beginning and that the rate has not changed. However, a worldwide flood such as the Bible describes would certainly have changed the rate of deposits during that period. Now, all of this is not to say that the universe is not billions of years old. It may be. However, the arguments in favor of a great age, they all possess presuppositions that simply cannot be proven. Likewise, when my critic here wrote to me and said, "It has been proven that a massive flood that covered the whole earth never happened," well, that person is being intellectually dishonest because it's an actual impossibility to prove that a worldwide flood never happened. The critic must presuppose many things in order to believe his conclusion. Also, before discussing the flood, as a side note, the discussion of the ark is important. The ark, as it was written, it is rightly designed for a universal flood. It had an accurate ratio of seaworthiness in its length to breadth to height. This ratio is what modern cargo ships use to withstand the strength of the sea. In fact, naval architects report that a long, box-shaped floating boxcar such as the Ark is the most stable kind of craft in turbulent waters. In addition, It must be mentioned that Noah would not have known how to construct such a ship of seaworthiness as a desert dweller in such ancient days. And finally, speaking from a biblical perspective, the flood must have been universal, worldwide, and not only an isolated area. Because the flood had been described in universal terms, the size of the ark suggests preparation for population larger than an isolated area. The duration of time, 1 year, indicates a large area from which the water would need to evaporate, recede. The mountains had been covered, and the nature of the flood was judgment, kataklumos, catastrophe, in which all people and animals were destroyed. God's commands to take animals of every kind would not have been required if only the life in a limited geographical area was to be destroyed. Animals could have migrated in to repopulate the region. And Genesis 10:32 declares that the whole world was repopulated after the flood from the 8 who were saved. Now, this would not have been true if those outside the local area had not drowned. In fact, Peter refers to the salvation of only 8 as a historical fact in 1 Peter 3:20. Further, the silt deposits in the Mesopotamian valley, they were from local flood or floods, not the universal flood from which preceded those later floods. The silt layers throughout the world are open to interpretation, including the possibility of a world catastrophe. There are also signs of dramatic changes in the position of the Earth's land masses. The mountains could have taken new, far higher shapes because of the unparalleled forces at work during the flood. So much has changed over time, and so much evidence has been lost that it's an actual impossibility to either prove or disprove the universal flood. And we must remember that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. I mean, just like any crime scene, strong winds, rain, volcanic activity, the shifting of geographic landscapes, animals moving and or destroying evidence, etc. Everything, they all play their roles in preservation of evidence or the loss of it. But if evidence has been lost, well, then it's lost. But that doesn't mean that evidence had never existed. And finally, God had promised to never do it again, which suggests that it could not have been an isolated area because God has most certainly flooded isolated areas since that time. Jesus also spoke of Noah and the flood as being historical, and he used it as the parallel for the end times. In addition, Noah and the flood are written as being historical by the apostles. And if the flood, a judgment upon all people, was only an isolated area, how did all people everywhere experience judgment? And if the flood is the parallel for the judgment of fire at the end of days, well, would that also only be an isolated area? And if so, why would the entire earth be destroyed and all people judged? Why would we receive a new earth and a new heavens? The parallel in focus here is judgment. All people outside the ark were judged for their wickedness, just as all people outside of Jesus' blood through faith in him will be judged for their wickedness. Thus, the flood must have been a universal judgment. But is there evidence for a universal flood? Now, well, fossil records might sometimes argue in its favor due to findings of fossils on mountaintops throughout the world, but again, more evidence than that would be needed to prove a worldwide flood. But in addition, more than 200 different cultures on all continents have stories about this kind of devastating flood. There are multiple accounts of non-biblical sources, all describing some type of great flood. Now, why would this be? I mean, did they all copy each other, even though they had all lived in different geographic locations? Or perhaps they all have a shared experience, and maybe they describe it just a little bit differently. So, in conclusion, Noah's great flood was a worldwide flood, according to the Bible. However, it's an actual impossibility to either prove or disprove the universal flood, and so faith will be required for one to believe the historical account of Noah's great flood. But should that be surprising? After all, faith is required for one to believe that Christ is returning with judgment of fire. Therefore, I believe that Noah's great flood is a matter of faith. But the real question to consider is this: will you be outside the grace of God when the Lord returns? Because once the door shuts, no one will be able to enter, just like the ark. As it turns out, I wrote an article on that. Investigate it thoroughly, and then let me know what you think. I'd like to collect your thoughts.